ongoing installment of candidate forums with 350 South Florida Action. 350 South Florida Action is the political action branch of 350 South Florida, which is part of 350.org, a global climate justice organization focused on ending our dependence on fossil fuels and promoting a renewable energy society as soon as possible, because that 350 refers to the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, 350 parts per million, that decades ago the International Panel on Climate Change scientists agreed would be kind of the safe level to avoid, really seeing impacts of climate change. So we're well above that now, over at 420 parts per million, and we need to really start making sure that that level starts going down as fast as possible if we're going to avoid the 2 °C rise in global temperatures, above which we're going to see really catastrophic climate change that could disrupt civilization as we know it. So the stakes are pretty high during this election season. And I just wanted to welcome Dotie Joseph, who's currently a representative in the Florida House, representing North Dade. I guess she can explain a bit more about what her district is like and why she's running for re-election, and maybe like a 2-minute introduction, and then we'll get to some prepared questions, and then we'll have some Q&A from the audience at the end.
Awesome.
So without any further ado, we'll let Representative Joseph take it away.
Awesome. Thank you for the invitation. So my name is State Representative Dotie Joseph. For those who don't know me, I was born in Haiti, raised in Miami, public schools all throughout, Yale undergrad, Georgetown Law, civil rights attorney. When I was in college, I interned with Congressman Peter Deutsch in Florida and in Washington, D.C. In between college and law school, I worked with President Jimmy Carter, working on things in Latin America, the Caribbean, and West Africa, from democracy development to sustainable development, and all lovely things there. When I graduated, I clerked for a judge, a federal judge, and then went on to litigate employment discrimination class actions all around the United States. Some of went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and I unapologetically kicked butt. Came back home to Miami to serve. I became the first Black attorney ever to work at the City of North Miami Beach, assistant deputy and interim city attorney, past president of the Haitian Lawyers Association, member of various Democratic clubs, past vice chair of the Miami-Dade DEC. I've gotten just about every environmental endorsement that there is, and I'm probably one of the leaders in environmental policy on the House side in the Florida legislature. So I am excited to be here.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We're glad to have you. So obviously, right now is pretty interesting times we're living in, like that Chinese proverb says. We have the COVID pandemic. We have, ongoing historical racial injustice and outbreaks of police brutality. We have economic, collapse that's imminent because of COVID, and of course we have climate change looming over all of that. Definitely an interesting time to choose to be in public service. But how do you see these issues relate to each other, and what would you be doing in the Florida House, especially given that Democrats have the minority, to help address them?
Sure. Let me tweak something that you said earlier about the economic collapse being impending as a result of COVID. Well, that's not necessarily the case. When you have poor leadership, that's the case. But if we look around the world, we have countries like New Zealand and several others that are women-led, or led by leaders who believe in climate change and science and understand what that means, who have taken proactive measures, who have either never had to shut down their economies because they took appropriate measures at the outset, or are opening back up fully now with 0 new cases of COVID, when we're having just the opposite result as a so-called first world country. So, let's be clear that, representation matters, and who you have in office matters. So, jumping right into what you're talking about in terms of, being a Democrat, there are lots of things that we know that we could be doing differently. And we have plenty of examples, not just worldwide, but even across these United States, since we haven't been getting any consistent federal guidance on, what we need to be doing with the intersection of a lot of those things. So in a vacuum like that, a couple of things happen. At the local level, leaders have started to implement measures to protect themselves. In the legislature, I have colleagues, while me and a lot of my Democratic colleagues, and even some of the Republican ones who have since, are advocating for things like mask mandates to stop the spread, stop community spread. I have a colleague who's going around suing municipalities for mask laws, which is absurd, but that's what we deal with, right, in the Florida legislature. So that being said, there are a lot of things that folks like myself and members of the Democratic caucus would like to do to alleviate some of the issues that you identified. So I'll talk about those, and then I'll run into some of the stuff that I've been doing personally to mitigate some of the stuff. So we have asked for a special session to fix our broken unemployment compensation system. So if you've been paying attention at all, you know that our unemployment compensation system is just a hot Republican mess. I don't know what else to call it. And even Republicans now who are in office, including the governor, recognize the failures of this system and recognize that probably his predecessor and a couple of other folks are responsible, namely the Republican majority who voted that new law in place to make Florida's unemployment compensation probably one of the worst in the entire nation in terms of the length that you can get benefits, in terms of how easy it is to access those benefits. And let's be clear what these benefits are. This is not free money coming from the state. This is money that was paid in by your employer by your time worked, right? So you're not begging for anything that you're not entitled to. You're absolutely entitled to that money. But it's just unfortunate that our system, the way it's set up, it doesn't allow for people to address that. So that's one. There are a whole host of other issues that we wanted to address, everything from COVID spending, and I'm concerned about some of the spending coming from, the executive branch right now in the absence of the legislature, so that we can make sure we properly exercise the power of the purse. So that's enough about generic stuff. Let me talk specifically about some of the things that I've been working on to address some of these issues in underserved communities and throughout the entire district. So different parts of my district, you mentioned earlier it's North Dade, but to be more specific, it includes Miami Shores, El Portal, Biscayne Park, parts of the city of Miami, including Liberty City, Little Haiti Design District, and parts of North Miami and whole swaths of unincorporated North Dade. So the issues are varied throughout the district. But when it comes to protecting yourself against COVID, it's the same. Everybody wants to have access to testing. You want to make sure that you're getting the right information. So two things that I took on myself is to make sure that the information was accessible both in Spanish and in Haitian Creole, which was not the case at the state level. So it took lots of hounding people at the state level with administration to make sure that we could get that information that's being shared about COVID-19 and the resources available and the warnings that we were giving out to make sure it's accessible to our non-English speaking population, specifically folks that speak Spanish and Haitian Creole. So that was one. Two, another area of concern was making sure that people who didn't have a vehicle had access to testing as well. So with a lot of pushing, I helped broker a partnership between the state of Florida and Miami-Dade County, whereby we got our first walk-up testing site in the entire county. And there have been several more since then, but that was an example. And then making sure, folks, regardless of your immigration status, you also have access to testing, because that just puts everybody at risk if people can't access testing. So those are a few things, in addition to making sure we get free masks to folks who can't afford masks, making sure we get food to people who can no longer feed their families. Those are some things that my office, over and above just being a traditional state representative, just making sure that our community is taken care of.
Great. Well, thank you so much for all of your proactive measures on that. That sounds like I know the answer here, but I'm going to go ahead and ask anyway. So, a lot of groups, like 350 have been pushing for a just recovery due to the COVID pandemic, which includes a lot of the things that you mentioned. that, the federal aid packages need to prioritize health above all, provide direct economic relief, put people over profit. So businesses that are getting, federal aid money need to meet, labor standards, pay a living wage, allow workers to organize, and invest in a regenerative economy so that we actually can avoid future crises by restoring our natural protective infrastructure, as well as building a renewable energy infrastructure, and then protecting democracy by funding the post office and the census, and allowing people to vote by mail. So I'm assuming that you agree with those principles of a just recovery, and since you mentioned a lot of them.
I do, and I can underscore several of them. Let's start with the census, for example. At the federal level, so I serve at the state level, but at the federal level, the House was trying to get a measure to extend the time to count people in the census. And so far, the Republicans in the Senate have stalled that measure. What that means is we need to get all our counting done by September unless something changes. So for people who don't understand the importance of the census, it is what determines what federal resources get allocated throughout the United States and its territories. Everything from library access to measures to support sustainable development by or resiliency resources by local governments at the county and city levels. It's going to determine whether we have more representation. We see the battles coming out of Washington, D.C., and we know that representation matters. Before we entered this, census cycle, Florida was on track to gain 2 representatives in Congress. Now, because of undercounting, we are on track to lose 1 and maybe 2, which is a very big deal when we're talking about being able to fight for resources at the federal level. So all of the things that you just mentioned are super important. And I definitely support making sure we have access. One of the things that was particularly frustrating to me coming out of this legislative session, we had a lot of really good bipartisan wins, right? Because everything is not necessarily Republican or Democrat. For example, affordable housing, that's something, in addition to climate gentrification, that touches our communities, particularly in my community, to make sure people have access to livable housing on the wages that they have, right? So we fought really hard and came to a good, place with Democrats and Republicans. And for the first time in close to 15 years, or maybe 10 years, the Sadowski Affordable Housing Trust Fund was not swept. I'm so proud of that, because that was one of my biggest things going into the legislature. But then our governor went and took some of those funds in his large veto thing, and then replenished some of it, or most of it, with some funds coming from the CARES Act. But those funds are much more restricted in what they can be used for. I would have much preferred that he just use those funds and supplement it, as opposed to taking stuff out and putting it back in. But whatever, that's water on the bridge now. But there are lots of things that we could be doing to help alleviate a lot of the stuff that you just talked about. Another thing that we had, for the first time in 10 years, every single city in my district, every village, got some money in the budget for something. And a lot of that had to do with infrastructure and resiliency issues, getting people from septic to sewer, which is a big deal in 2 or 3 of my municipalities. And we got funding for it. And then this governor went and he just decided he just wanted to do a blanket $1 billion cut for Lord knows what. And Republicans and Democrats alike, so nobody was safe. But instead, earlier in the year, he had an opportunity to get some more funds by not issuing these superfluous corporate tax cuts. And that's what he decided to do instead. So how do you cut money from a food pantry during a pandemic? Who does? Anyway, I don't need to ask who does it, because we already saw it done. But those are the kind of things. All we can do is keep pushing, because the legislature has its role, but with our system of checks and balances and separation of powers, the executive has their role. And if he wants to veto these things, I have a pretty decent relationship with folks in his office and with him in general. So I think being able to highlight these things, maybe he'll revisit those vetoes, so he doesn't do that again next time. I would hope that that's the case, and that we're doing better with the pandemic by the time that comes around. But as the legislature, we're going to continue to do our part to make sure that people have the resources they need.
Right. Well, you mentioned climate gentrification and infrastructure, which definitely are two issues that certainly I know affect a lot of neighborhoods in your district. Um, well, do you want to just briefly expound on what is meant by climate gentrification and what you've been doing to fight it?
Sure. So let's talk. So for folks who may not know what climate gentrification is, so the concept of gentrification is when you have different groups of people moving into an area that displaces other groups of people who are traditionally there, right? And it could be, ethnic, cultural, economic, whatever. There's all kinds of gentrification. When we're talking about climate gentrification in the context of South Florida, what that means is people who are living in lower level, sea level areas going to higher level sea level areas where the land is higher than sea level, and putting out people who were traditionally there. And those higher level places tend to be more away from the water, but not always. There's some pockets where we have some lower sea level places throughout the district and throughout South Florida. But what happens is, for example, in the case of parts of the city of Miami, where one of the commissioners who's in charge of that area, arguably did not do a great job at protecting the people there or the businesses there. So for folks who don't understand how that works, there's little that can be done about that at the state level. That's very much a local issue. And by local, I mean specifically at the city level, and then also at the county level. That's where people engage in what can be done or not done in terms of what they give developers access to, what kind of restrictions you want to put on. There are some things that we could do at the state level in terms of preemption, but not a whole lot in terms of protection or proactive counterbalancing. Some other parts of the United States have done a much better job of that. Unfortunately, that has not been the case in the city of Miami.
Yeah, for sure. And then you also mentioned the infrastructure disparity. I live in Miami Beach, and we, I guess we were fortunate enough, I guess, to have the ability to replace and renovate our sewage system. And being so close to the shore, obviously as sea levels rise, that's going to place a huge burden on septic tanks and aging sewage infrastructure. And I know that a lot of places in your district have had boil water warnings when there's just a heavy rain, just because of the overtaxing of that system. So obviously, there's all sorts of funds that could be allocated for that. If the governor is not going to do it, is there a way to get it from the federal government directly, or how do you think that we can really accelerate that?
Sure. So most of the federal dollars that will come will be filtered through the state governments. Very rarely do they send it directly, unless there's some specific programs that exist, that usually comes through, whether it's the environmental department or different transportation departments or different departments that have to do with infrastructure, where there's a specific project that it can go directly to that. Not too long ago at the federal level, they took away representatives, Congress people's ability to fund certain projects in a particular way, more directly. So that makes it harder for our congressional representatives to do kind of what you're talking about. But that being said, I think, another backup plan, which is what I'm already working with the governor's staff with, is, didn't make it through the budget. Is there another way that we can get the resources to those communities? And part of that has to do with the water management districts. Sometimes there are different resources available through that front that might be able to help alleviate some of the issues that you're talking about. So, for example, I'm actively exploring those because I know it's still a need, regardless of whether it made it into this year's budget or not. Yes, it's great that it made it in the budget, but it didn't survive the veto. It's really discouraging, the veto, because it's one thing to veto because you don't believe in a particular thing, but he just had a blanket veto because he just wanted to do $1 billion cut for, I'm not even sure why. So that was just something he wanted to do, so he did it. The issue with that arbitrariness is, real people suffer. So I don't know, we're going to keep fighting.
Definitely. Well, before the pandemic hit, I think it's safe to say that our governor's pretty much botched that as badly as you possibly could. Governor DeSantis did, make some efforts to towards positive strides on reducing oil drilling on Florida lands and improving water quality. Do you feel like that was, clearly not enough, but do you feel like his commitments are genuine, and just doesn't really know how to go about it, or was it just lip service?
I definitely would not presume that he's not being genuine. I don't get that from him. I think he makes a concerted effort. So let me say this. I talk a lot of crap about Republicans because I'm a Democrat. But when they do good, I praise them for doing good. When they fall short, I try to work with them to improve it. And then when they completely miss the mark, I call them out. I have no problem operating in the full spectrum of that range. That being said, I do believe that, we had a very low bar as it relates to environmental issues before Governor DeSantis came into office. So, on some levels, he has been a breath of fresh air, pun intended, to having somebody who at least makes the effort or says that they make the effort. In the world within which I operate, in this Republican-dominated politics that is Florida, they control everything, right? They control the legislature, they control the governor's mansion, and they're basically in control of the Florida Supreme Court. So they've got everything on lock. And if you're in my line of succession, not only are they occupying the White House, but they're the county mayor and they're the city mayor as well. So, you have to figure out a way to work with people. And one of the easiest ways for me to be productive in working with people is not to assume the worst, right? And I do not assume the worst with Governor DeSantis at every turn where I've made overtures to address certain things, like the things that I talked to you about right now that I told you that I was able to accomplish at the state level, whether it's in terms of getting language access or the statewide testing, it's in collaboration with his administration that I was able to do that. So, there's room for maneuvering. Is it as ideal as it could be? I mean, clearly not, right? But I think that his administration is one that is one that's open to suggestions and improvement in a way that we have not seen in a long time.
So there is some hope.
Yes, there's always hope, as long as you're willing to be persistent and not demonize the folks on the other side, because at the end of the day, they're people too. And what I've found is a lot of the folks in the legislature, Democrat and Republican alike, are actually trying to do a good job. Now, the way they go about it, based on whatever their background is, their worldview is, or what they've been explained and believed to be true, may be different. So it might take some convincing. But I don't necessarily go into it, with a few rare exceptions, into thinking that people are going in to just hurt people.
All right. Okay, so I got one more question, and then we have a question from the audience. So you are on the Energy Committee in Tallahassee, and FPL obviously is our local utility monopoly. They've been accused of blocking access to solar, for individual rooftop solar. Do you have any thoughts about how the role of FPL in Florida politics, and how to see more renewable energy without their approval?
So there's a multiple questions you stuck in there. So the role of FPL in Florida politics. So my interactions with FPL have actually been rather productive when an issue arises, whether it's, during the pandemic, we had a concern about people being either going to be kicked off or not, or how they're going to handle late payments, during the pandemic, during the height of the pandemic, but, arguably still in there. And they've been tracking that based on Governor DeSantis's, I guess, emergency orders. So they've been responsive, and whenever somebody reaches out to my office and they have an individual concern, we're usually able to work that out, right? So that's mostly been my interaction with FPL. In terms of can something get done without FPL's permission? I mean, sure. I can't imagine why not. It would be great to have them on board, right? Like, to the extent that you could. And I think I saw some information about FPL um, contributing to some kind of renewable energy. Like I remember seeing a presentation that was done. So I'd be happy to connect you guys to them to hash out anything further. But let me just say this. A lot of times we go at, especially us on the, you know, whether it's the moderate to the far left, as they like to call it. Sometimes we approach things in terms of the person's evil, they're doing bad things, and that may very well be true. I don't know, right? It depends on each circumstance. But if you give somebody, and this is just basic social psychology, if you give somebody the opportunity to say, hey, here's what I'd like done, how can we work to do it, as opposed to you're evil, you need to do, and people get defensive, right? So I'm not saying FPL is a person that gets offended and defensive, but depending on how people interact, that either makes it easier to get things done or harder to get things done. I hope that makes sense. So if there's something specific that we can work on, I'm happy to help, facilitate some discussions. Because I'm not one of those politicians that's just here to, say stuff and make noise or whatever. I'm here to actually get things done. And I think my record has spoken to that as a freshman Democrat, being able to actually pass bills and do stuff. It's because I have that measured approach to get the things that we know that we care about done, but at the same time, trying to figure out a way to be as inclusive as possible. But if we can't, then I'm okay to just fight.
Great. Well, we definitely would love to stay in touch about, encouraging FPL to relax a lot of their obstacles to rooftop solar so that we can, allow individuals to make that choice in an effective and cost-effective way for them. So I think you said you had to go pretty soon. So we'll have one question from Joanne.
One question real quick, but then I gotta run.
Gotcha. Yes, so Joanne wants to know that the COVID pandemic has uncovered a lot of vulnerabilities and disparities across the state. We're facing more frequent and intense storms, flooding, displacement due to climate gentrification, housing insecurity, food insecurity. What do you envision or are currently exploring to have in place a platform that can protect vulnerable communities and allow them to bounce back quicker? What's the best way for community leaders to collaborate with you to push forward this initiative? So I know you addressed a little bit of that already, but
right, I touched on a little bit of that, but so a couple of things that COVID has exacerbated that pre-existed the pandemic, right? So I mentioned the affordable housing crisis. Another thing that's been exacerbated is health disparities, right? So here are a couple of things that I'm working on. One is as it relates to affordable housing, obviously at the state level, making sure that we're protecting that, but working with local level, because they're the ones who have the resources to do it. So at the state level, we give you the funds in the trust fund, but it's the local level that spends it and decides how to allocate those funds. And then we got some additional funds that came from the federal level to go through these municipalities as well. So it's really coming up with programs that are responsive to some of those needs, but make no mistake about it, a lot of those needs were there well before COVID and had nothing to do with COVID. It's because we don't have a livable wage. It's because of terrible underemployment. I mean, a whole host of issues that I'm sure we can have lots of time to discuss. So that's one. As it relates to healthcare disparities, I've been working with various groups who are focused on that. There's some health task force. There's some Black doctors who had some really innovative ideas. And when I'm one of those people, again, I try to just get stuff done. We're done with our budget cycle at the state level. Nothing is going to happen again until next year. So budget-wise, from the legislature, unless there's a special session called, which the Republicans have consistently refused, nothing is going to happen at the state level, other than whatever's coming out of the executive branch, unless some other things shift that dynamic. So that's one. But outside of that, I've reached out to some friends who are, in private industry to see if we can fund some of the projects that would help alleviate some of the issues that have been identified to combat these health disparities. Everything from education to additional testing to more access to healthcare. One of the easiest things that we could do is expand Medicaid, but the Republicans just refuse to consider it. But that's something that happens at the state level. So, there's a lot to be done. Whoever wants to connect with me, let's connect after the election. That's after August 18, because right now I'm in focus mode, but there's a lot that I would like to do and we can figure out different ways to maneuver that. All right.
Great. Well, thanks so much for taking the time today, for your fantastic work in Tallahassee, and good luck with the campaign. Did you have anything else that you wanted to add?
Sure. So today is the second to last day of our deadline to raise any money. So if you like what you heard and you want to send me back to Tallahassee to keep fighting for all of us, because I probably filed some of the most environmentally related bills in the entire House, from a tax credit for carbon farming, support for resiliency measures in Miami-Dade County. So if you like what you hear, please support my campaign. That's just dotiejoseph.com/give, or dotiejoseph.com, click on contribute, or you can search for me on ActBlue, Dotie Joseph with the 1 TIE, just like it shows in the background. So that's one. Two, if you're looking to volunteer on election day, not even just now. So yeah, I'm talking about my primary, but let me tell you, in November, we are literally in the fight for our lives. Whether you're talking about environmentally, whether you're talking about Black Lives Matter, whether you're talking about any of those issues. So one of the biggest things I'm going to encourage people to do is make sure for November, you get everybody registered to vote if they're not already registered to vote. Before November, make sure you complete your census, and vote by mail, and vote like your lives depend on it, because it does. If you think about all the people who have passed away from COVID that did not need to, had we done things differently in this United States, if you think about our military overseas that are literally being hunted down by our enemies with impunity by the person who's supposed to be our commander in chief. I mean, I could go on and on. Y'all hear me? Like, we need to, this is it. Like, whatever happens this election, this is like straight up, no exaggeration. You see what's going on with the arrest in Oregon. If this continues, this will change the entire trajectory of not only this nation, but the entire world order. So the stuff you read about in textbooks, we're living what's going to happen now. So please, 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 everybody do your part. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great day. Good luck.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.